Welcome to my history channel. This video may be long, but if you stay until the end, you may finally understand why Germany repeatedly rose from collapse, why it fell into destruction twice, and how it became one of the most powerful nations in the modern world. Civilization often forges its greatest enemies from the very shadows it refuses to understand. Chapter 1: The Land of Barbarians. More than 2,000 years ago, the mighty Roman Empire believed it had mastered the entire known world. They built magnificent stone cities, forged unbreakable laws, and commanded legions that crushed every resisting nation. Yet, when General Julius Caesar stood upon the banks of the Rhine River, he peered into an impenetrable dark forest. Within those ancient shadows lived a people who utterly defied the rigid order of Roman civilization. The Romans dismissively labeled them as barbarians, calling their wild territories Germania. According to the Roman historian Tacitus, these Germanic tribes lived in scattered settlements, brewing primitive beer from oak branches and rejecting the comforts of stone architecture. They were not a single unified nation, but rather a loosely connected alliance of proud, fierce tribes. These included the Goths, Franks, Saxons, and Vandals, each driven by an unquenchable thirst for absolute freedom. Why do powerful empires always assume that primitive cultures yearn for their so-called advanced civilization? To the refined citizens of Rome, these tall, golden-haired, and blue-eyed warriors were merely uncivilized savages destined for inevitable subjugation. They believed that providing stone roads and complex legal systems was a divine gift. However, the Germanic peoples viewed Roman order as a terrifying prison designed to strip away their ancestral sovereignty and spiritual autonomy. The Roman Emperor Augustus viewed the Rhine River not just as a natural boundary, but as a temporary hurdle in his grand vision of complete global conquest. He desperately wanted to push the borders of his majestic empire further east toward the Elbe River, seeking to completely tame the wild heart of Europe. Augustus stationed massive military encampments along the water, preparing to bring the ultimate light of Rome into the endless northern darkness. The imperial legions marched with absolute arrogance, believing that no primitive force could ever withstand their highly disciplined and methodical military formations. For a brief period, it appeared that the Germanic tribes would suffer the exact same tragic fate as the recently conquered Gauls. Roman garrisons were established, brutal taxes were demanded, and the heavy yoke of imperial assimilation began to crush the ancient traditions of the dark forest. But the Romans fatally misunderstood the deep, untamable spirit of the Germanic soul. They placed their absolute trust in a brilliant Germanic chieftain named Arminius, who had been raised as a favored hostage in Rome. Arminius had been meticulously trained in their advanced military tactics and granted Roman citizenship. Yet, beneath his polished Roman armor, the fierce blood of the tribal forest still boiled, with an unforgiving desire for violent retribution and liberation. In the autumn of the year 9 Anno Domini, the illusion of Roman invincibility was violently and permanently shattered. Arminius orchestrated a masterful and devastating betrayal against his imperial masters. He deceitfully lured 3 elite Roman legions, commanded by the arrogant and unsuspecting General Verus, deep into the impenetrable and terrifying depths of the Teutoburg Forest. The Romans were completely blind to the approaching apocalyptic slaughter waiting patiently within the shadows. The orderly Roman formations suddenly found themselves hopelessly trapped within a suffocating nightmare of thick mud, driving rain, and dense timber. Germanic warriors swept down from the obscured shadows like vengeful spirits, mercilessly slaughtering over 15,000 highly trained Roman soldiers. The unmatched discipline of the legions completely crumbled beneath the primal fury of men fighting desperately for the very survival of their sacred homeland and their families. The shock of this monumental defeat sent violent and unprecedented tremors throughout the entire Roman world. The concept of defeat was entirely foreign to the imperial mindset. It is said that an agonized Emperor Augustus wandered his palace halls throughout the night, violently bashing his head against the marble walls and screaming frantically for Varus to return his destroyed legions. Rome was forced to confront the terrifying limits of its own power. This single brutal battle profoundly altered the entire trajectory of European history and human civilization. The bloody victory in the Teutoburg Forest permanently halted Roman expansion, cementing the Rhine River as the absolute northern boundary of the empire. Because of this crucial stand, the Germanic tribes successfully resisted Romanization, preserving their unique language, independent culture, and ferocious love for individual autonomy that still defines the nation today. This monumental clash forged a powerful myth of resistance that would resonate through the centuries of German collective memory. The fundamental seeds of modern Germany were not peacefully planted in the orderly forums of Rome, but violently watered by blood beneath the ancient canopies of the deep woods. By rejecting Roman domination, they remained disconnected from the comforting embrace of Mediterranean civilization, choosing instead the dangerous freedom of the northern wilderness. While the rest of Western Europe eventually fell under the centralizing influence of Roman law and administration, the Germanic lands remained proudly fragmented. This early embrace of decentralized tribal independence established a deep psychological pattern that would haunt the German people for millennia. The eternal struggle between the desperate yearning for national unity and the fierce protection of local sovereignty had officially begun within the blood-soaked mud of the Teutoburg Forest. The deepest roots of freedom are always watered by the blood of empires. Great empires are rarely built upon peace. They are forged through the ruthless consolidation of chaos. Chapter 2. The Birth of Empire. As the mighty Western Roman Empire finally crumbled into dust, the European continent plunged into terrifying darkness and absolute anarchy. However, from this bloody void, a powerful Germanic tribe known as the Franks began to swiftly rise to unprecedented dominance. They recognized that brute strength alone could never sustain a lasting dynasty without the crucial illusion of divine blessing and spiritual authority. The Frankish king Clovis made a brilliant and calculating political decision by willingly converting to Catholicism. This monumental choice forged an unbreakable and dangerous alliance between the brutal Germanic swords and the sacred altars of Rome. By aligning with the Church, the Franks instantly transformed their bloody conquests into holy crusades, rapidly expanding their iron grip across the fractured remains of Western Europe. The ultimate pinnacle of Frankish power was finally reached under the legendary rule of Charlemagne. He relentlessly campaigned across the continent, conquering vast territories that encompassed modern France, Germany, and Italy. In the year 800, the Pope placed the sacred Roman crown upon his head, resurrecting the imperial ghost and declaring him the Emperor of the Romans. Charlemagne masterfully wielded both the sword and the cross to unify his colossal kingdom, establishing a brief illusion of European harmony. Yet, the inherent tragedy of absolute power is that it rarely survives the grave of the great man who forged it. Following his death, the once magnificent empire violently fractured under the weight of endless succession disputes and unforgiving feudal ambitions. In the year 843, the Treaty of Verdun officially severed the Grand Empire into three distinct pieces. The eastern fragment, known as East Francia, became the bloody cradle from which the modern German nation would eventually emerge. This fragmented territory was a chaotic collection of independent duchies, constantly teetering on the dangerous edge of complete internal annihilation. Order was only restored when a ruthless and brilliant leader named Otto the Great seized the fragile Eastern throne. Otto understood that to control the rebellious nobles, he needed a power greater than mere military force. He systematically appointed loyal church bishops to high administrative positions, masterfully blending secular authority with divine right to crush any potential internal defiance. Otto did not merely defend his borders, he marched south across the Alps to violently subjugate Italy and rescue the papacy. In the year 962, a grateful pope crowned Otto as the supreme ruler, officially giving birth to the Holy Roman Empire. The Germanic kings had finally claimed the universal authority that once belonged exclusively to the Caesars. The crown of heaven always carries the unbearable weight of earthly blood. The illusion of unity is often more dangerous than the reality of division. Chapter 3: Power and Fragmentation. When we look upon the grandeur of the Holy Roman Empire through the deceptive lens of history, we imagine a colossal European behemoth. We envision an unstoppable force dictating the fate of nations from a mighty central throne. Yet, the French philosopher Voltaire brilliantly pierced this magnificent facade with devastating precision. He famously declared that this sprawling entity was neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. Beneath the glittering imperial crown existed a terrifyingly fractured reality that resembled a chaotic jigsaw puzzle, missing its interlocking pieces. The German lands were severely fragmented into hundreds of independent duchies, wealthy free cities, and powerful sovereign bishoprics. Site 5. Each microscopic state jealously guarded its own unique laws, maintained separate armies, and fiercely resisted any attempt at genuine national consolidation. Why did Germany remain brutally divided while neighboring France and England systematically forged highly centralized modern nations? The answer lies in the fatal flaw of the imperial election system. Unlike other European monarchies, where power was smoothly inherited by blood, the German emperor was elected by the most powerful nobles. These nobles deliberately chose weak rulers to protect their own absolute local authority. This disastrous power dynamic was officially codified in the year 1356 through a document known as the Golden Bull. This decree permanently granted the 7 most powerful princes the exclusive right to choose the sovereign by legally cementing the arrogant independence of the local lords. The Golden Bull effectively destroyed any hope for a unified German state. The emperor essentially became a glorified hostage within his own staggeringly vast domain. He functioned merely as a symbolic figurehead rather than an absolute dictator, wielding unquestioned authority to raise a functioning army or collect meaningful taxes for foreign wars. The emperor had to desperately beg for the conditional support of arrogant princes who cared only for their own narrow regional interests. Consequently, the German people paid a devastating psychological and economic price for this endless internal political stagnation. Without a unified national market, Greedy local lords imposed suffocating tolls every few miles along the Rhine River. Trade was ruthlessly choked by endless bureaucracy, preventing the economic prosperity that a naturally industrious population profoundly deserved. They survived as a scattered people, speaking one language without one voice. A kingdom composed entirely of kings will inevitably become a land without a shield. Faith is often the sharpest blade in the brutal arena of political survival. Chapter 4: The Struggle Between Throne and Altar. Throughout the Middle Ages, the Holy Roman Empire was consumed by an endless and devastating war for absolute supremacy. This was not a simple conflict fought over stolen territory or earthly resources, but a profound battle between the sacred cross and the imperial crown. The emperors desperately wanted to control the church, while the popes demanded complete subjugation from the throne. The ultimate flashpoint of this epic struggle was known as the investiture controversy. For centuries, German monarchs relied heavily upon loyal bishops and powerful abbots to manage their sprawling, fragmented territories. Because church officials could not legally produce legitimate heirs, the emperor could reclaim their vast estates upon their death. Therefore, the absolute right to appoint these crucial religious figures was the fundamental bedrock of imperial political power. However, the fiercely ambitious Pope Gregory VII radically challenged this established order during the 11th century. He issued a terrifying decree declaring that the papacy possessed universal unquestioned authority over all earthly rulers. Gregory audaciously claimed the divine right to excommunicate and depose any secular monarch who dared to defy the sacred will of Rome. This aggressive declaration instantly severed the delicate balance of power governing the European continent. Emperor Henry IV furiously responded by attempting to violently depose the arrogant pope from his holy seat. In retaliation, Gregory unveiled the ultimate spiritual weapon by completely excommunicating the German emperor. This devastating act instantly dissolved every oath of loyalty that the German princes had sworn to their sovereign ruler. The opportunistic local lords joyfully embraced this divine excuse to rebel against the crown and expand their own sovereign power. Cornered and desperate, Emperor Henry was forced to undertake one of the most humiliating journeys in recorded human history. In the bitter winter of 1077, he crossed the freezing Alps and stood barefoot in the snow outside the castle of Canossa. For 3 exhausting days, the most powerful monarch in Europe shivered like a common penitent beggar, desperately pleading for the spiritual forgiveness of the Pope. While Henry eventually regained his sacred crown, the terrifying damage to the imperial authority was already permanent and irreversible. The mystical aura of divine invincibility surrounding the German emperor had been shattered in front of the entire world. The relentless feud between the throne and the altar dragged on for decades, plunging the fractured German lands into endless cycles of devastating civil war and brutal political treachery. This perpetual conflict ultimately cemented the disastrous fragmentation of the German nation for centuries to come. Whenever an emperor attempted to centralize his fleeting power, the Pope would deliberately fund rebellious princes to sabotage the effort. The Holy Roman Empire functioned not as a unified sovereign state, but as a perpetual bloody chessboard for competing arrogant factions. The heavens remained silent while men bled for the right to speak in its name. A throne built upon compromise will eventually crumble under the weight of its own concessions. Chapter 5: The Collapse of Unity. During the 12th century, the brilliant Hohenstaufen dynasty desperately attempted to restore the fading glory of the imperial crown. Emperor Frederick I, famously known as Barbarossa, added the word holy to his official title to directly challenge the absolute authority of the Pope. However, to finance his endless military campaigns down into Italy, he tragically surrendered unprecedented authority and sovereign rights to the ambitious German princes. This disastrous policy reached its absolute zenith under his grandson, Emperor Frederick II. Raised in the sun-drenched palaces of Sicily, he barely spoke the German language and viewed his northern homeland merely as a distant source of military funding. To ensure total peace while he fought distant wars, he legally granted the German princes the supreme right to mint coins, collect tolls, and construct impregnable castles. When the Hohenstaufen bloodline finally extinguished, in the year 1250, the Holy Roman Empire plunged into a terrifying void known as the Great Interregnum. For over 2 decades, the German lands existed without a universally recognized sovereign ruler. Ruthless robber knights prowled the lawless countryside, and ambitious feudal lords engaged in endless, bloody micro-wars simply to expand their tiny fractions of stolen and disputed territory. Attempting to bring order to this unbearable chaos, Emperor Charles IV issued a devastating legal document in 1356 known as the Golden Bull. Instead of centralizing power, this imperial edict permanently institutionalized the total fragmentation of the German state. It granted 7 elite electoral princes the absolute right to choose the next monarch, effectively ensuring that only weak men would ever hold the highest office. Yet, within this vast political ruin, the extraordinary resilience of the German people began to secretly flourish, lacking a powerful central government to protect their vital commercial interests. Wealthy merchant cities decided to forge their own sovereign destiny. They formed the magnificent Hanseatic League, a colossal economic empire stretching across the Baltic Sea that wielded its own formidable navy and dictated international trade without any imperial permission. True power does not reside in the glittering crown you wear, but in the solid earth you can actually control. True revolution does not always begin with a sword. Sometimes it begins with a single-nailed piece of paper. Chapter 6: Reformation and Thought Revolution. In the early 16th century, the magnificent Catholic Church held an absolute and unquestioned monopoly over human salvation. To finance their opulent Roman cathedrals, the papacy began selling indulgences, essentially demanding earthly gold in direct exchange for heavenly forgiveness. For the exhausted and impoverished German peasants, this was not simply spiritual guidance, but a brutal financial extortion wrapped in sacred Latin decrees that they could not even comprehend. In 1517, an obscure monk named Martin Luther decided that true faith could no longer be purchased like a common marketplace commodity. He bravely walked to the castle church in Wittenberg and nailed 95 furious theses directly onto its heavy wooden doors. This defiant act was not merely a theological dispute. It was a devastating declaration of independence against the most powerful and terrifying institution on earth. Luther fundamentally believed that every single individual possessed the divine right to communicate directly with the heavens without relying upon corrupt earthly middlemen. To achieve this monumental vision, he accomplished something far more revolutionary than simply splitting the church. He translated the sacred New Testament entirely, from elitist Latin into the common spoken dialect, single-handedly forging the standardized modern German language and unifying a fractured people through words. The profound impact of this monumental translation echoed far beyond the confines of religion and Sunday worship. Luther recognized that a people who cannot read can never truly defend their own intellectual or spiritual freedom. He became a fierce pioneer for universal public education, demanding that earthly rulers construct schools with the exact same urgency that they used to build necessary bridges and pave crucial public roads. This groundbreaking demand laid the absolute foundation for the legendary German education system, long before France or England even recognized the urgent need. While other powerful European nations ignored the minds of their poor citizens, the German lands methodically cultivated generations of highly disciplined and literate thinkers. This relentless educational drive cultivated the astonishing intellectual soil that would eventually birth countless brilliant philosophers, legendary composers, and Nobel laureates. Yet, this monumental awakening also embedded a dangerous and unforgiving rigidity deep within the German cultural psyche. Luther demanded absolute rationality and unwavering adherence to conviction, regardless of the earthly consequences that might follow. This intense dedication to uncompromising order forged incredible industrial prowess, but it also created a deep societal vulnerability to absolute authority that would eventually lead the nation into terrifying and unprecedented global catastrophes. A mind liberated by reason can just as easily be captivated by the darkest of absolutes. Religion was intended to save the human soul, but it ultimately became the perfect excuse to destroy the human body. Chapter 7: War and Destruction. Following the profound intellectual shockwaves of the Reformation, the German lands existed in a terrifying state of fragile equilibrium. The magnificent Catholic Habsburg dynasty desperately yearned to restore absolute religious and political uniformity across their vast fractured empire. Meanwhile, the fiercely independent Protestant princes refused to surrender their hard-won spiritual and sovereign freedoms. This suffocating tension required only a single spark to ignite, a continental apocalyptic conflagration. In the year 1618, that fatal spark finally ignited within the restless Bohemian city of Prague. Furious Protestant nobles violently defied the oppressive decrees of their fanatical Catholic king by throwing his arrogant imperial representatives directly out of a high castle window. This seemingly isolated act of desperate rebellion instantly triggered a massive chain reaction of catastrophic violence that rapidly engulfed the entire European continent in unrelenting bloodshed. What began as a regional theological dispute swiftly devolved into a ruthless international struggle for absolute European dominance. Neighboring empires like France, Sweden, and Spain ravenously sent their massive armies plunging deep into the unfortunate heart of the German territories. These foreign powers cared absolutely nothing for the sacred heavens. They sought only to bleed their geopolitical rivals and carve lucrative new dominions from the suffering German soil. For 3 agonizing decades, the once beautiful and prosperous German countryside was violently transformed into a terrifying slaughterhouse. Endless hordes of ruthless mercenaries swept back and forth across the bleeding landscape, functioning more like ravenous locusts than disciplined soldiers. Because the feuding monarchs could not afford to feed their own massive armies, the starving troops were actively encouraged to brutally pillage, rape, and extort the defenseless civilian population without mercy. The scale of human devastation reached absolutely unprecedented and unimaginable extremes during the 30 Years' War. Entire thriving villages were burned completely to ashes, leaving nothing but rotting corpses and desolate silence in their horrific wake. Historians estimate that, in several crucial German regions, over half of the entire native population was brutally wiped out through relentless slaughter, unstoppable plagues, and severe man-made famines that plagued the scorched earth. When the exhausted and bankrupt European powers finally signed the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, they looked upon a completely annihilated nation. The Monumental Treaty officially ended the relentless slaughter and enshrined the sovereign rights of the countless fragmented German states. However, this diplomatic triumph merely certified the absolute and permanent political emasculation of the Holy Roman Empire on the grand stage of modern global history. The deep trauma of this unprecedented catastrophe permanently scarred the collective psychological architecture of the German people. They profoundly realized that, as long as they remained a weak and divided assortment of independent micronations, they would always serve as the helpless battlefield for arrogant foreign empires. This terrifying realization planted the deepest, most desperate seeds of militaristic nationalism that would eventually grow into a tremendous and unstoppable force. A nation broken on the anvil of war will eventually learn to forge itself into a hammer. A nation deprived of natural fortresses must build its walls from the iron discipline of its people. Chapter 8: The Rise of Prussia. While the rest of the German lands lay in complete economic and political ruin after decades of devastating conflict, a minor northern territory began a remarkable transformation. Prussia was an unforgiving, barren landscape characterized by harsh winters and poor sandy soil that yielded little agricultural wealth. Yet, the absolute poverty of their environment forced the Prussian rulers to cultivate the only abundant resource they possessed, which was human resilience. To survive surrounded by massive predatory empires, the Prussian kings forged a unique and terrifying social contract with their powerful aristocratic elite known as the Junkers. In strict exchange for maintaining absolute feudal control over their peasant populations, these noblemen were required to surrender their sons to the state. These privileged hires were systematically transformed into highly disciplined officers who pledged unwavering loyalty exclusively to the sovereign monarch. Under the ruthless reign of Frederick William I, Prussia effectively ceased being a traditional state that happened to command a military. Instead, it radically transformed into a colossal military machine that happened to possess a modest state to fund its relentless operations. The entire society was meticulously reorganized around the strict rhythms of the barracks, instilling a profound national culture of absolute obedience and unwavering duty. His son, Frederick the Great, brilliant and utterly ruthless, utilized this magnificent military apparatus to catapult Prussia onto the grand stage of European dominance. He audaciously invaded neighboring territories, plunging the continent into years of bitter warfare simply to elevate his own geopolitical standing. Through stunning tactical masterpieces against overwhelming odds, he solidified the terrifying reputation of the Prussian army and permanently shifted the continental balance of power. However, the true foundation of Prussian supremacy did not rest exclusively upon the bayonets of its formidable infantry. The monarchy recognized that a modern geopolitical power required a highly literate and technologically capable population to sustain its tremendous ambitions. Prussia became one of the first European nations to mandate strict universal public education, guaranteeing that every single citizen could read military orders and contribute to the industrial machinery. This relentless combination of intellectual cultivation and brutal military discipline forged a frighteningly efficient and obedient society. The Prussian people learned to revere unquestioned authority and glorify supreme state power above any trivial individual freedom. They were transformed into flawless cogs within a magnificent but terrifying national machine that subconsciously yearned for a glorious collective destiny. The scattered German peoples began to look toward Berlin with hope and apprehension. True strength is never born from comfort, but forged within the freezing fires of necessity. Peace is rarely forged through gentle words. It is usually hammered into existence by relentless force. Chapter 9: Blood and Iron. For centuries, the German people wandered through the dark corridors of history as a fractured collection of powerless states. They endured humiliation while unified neighbors like France and Britain effortlessly dominated the global stage. The deep yearning for a unified nation pervaded the hearts of the people, yet dreams alone could never dismantle the stubborn arrogance of the local princes. The time for peaceful diplomacy had utterly failed them. Before a nation can be unified by blood, it must first be bound together by gold and commerce. In 1834, the scattered German states formed a revolutionary customs union, effectively eradicating the suffocating internal trade barriers that had choked their prosperity for generations. Suddenly, a flourishing national market emerged, sparking a magnificent economic awakening. They finally understood that economic integration was the crucial precursor to genuine political sovereignty. Enter Otto von Bismarck, a ruthless and visionary statesman, appointed to command the ascendant power of Prussia. He held absolute contempt for ineffective politicians who delusionally believed that grand speeches could alter empires. Bismarck famously declared that the great questions would never be solved by majority resolutions, but exclusively through the unforgiving application of iron and blood. He chose the sword. Bismarck masterfully orchestrated a series of brilliant, coldly calculated wars to systematically eliminate any rivals to Prussian dominance. In 1864, he swiftly crushed Denmark to secure northern territories, testing the devastating efficiency of his modernized military. 2 years later, he audaciously turned his guns against Austria, the ancient hegemon of the German realm. In a stunning 7-week campaign, the Austrians were utterly and permanently expelled. To forge the final unbreakable bond among the remaining independent German states, Bismarck required a formidable external enemy. He brilliantly manipulated the arrogant French Emperor Napoleon III into declaring a disastrous war in 1870. The Prussian military machine utterly annihilated the French forces, capturing their humiliated sovereign on the battlefield. This spectacular triumph erased centuries of French domination and sent shockwaves across the entire European continent. In 1871, beneath the gilded ceilings of the Palace of Versailles, the victorious Prussian king was crowned emperor of a unified Germany. This ultimate humiliation of France marked the glorious birth of the Second Reich. Almost overnight, the German Empire harnessed the incredible power of the Second Industrial Revolution. They rapidly surpassed Britain and France in steel, chemicals, and electricity, becoming an unstoppable global industrial juggernaut. a sword that forges a nation can rarely be returned peacefully to its scabbard. Arrogance is the inevitable precursor to absolute destruction. Chapter 10. Collapse and Catastrophe. The magnificent German Empire, forged so brilliantly by blood and iron, rapidly became intoxicated by its own unprecedented power. Under the reckless and arrogant leadership of Emperor Wilhelm II, the nation abandoned the careful diplomatic balancing act that had originally secured its rise. He foolishly alienated crucial allies, like Russia and Britain, transforming the entire European continent into a terrifying powder keg waiting for a single spark. In 1914, that fatal spark ignited in Sarajevo, plunging the world into the unimaginable slaughter of the First World War. The German military machine fought with terrifying efficiency across two brutal fronts, but the nation was ultimately crushed by the sheer weight of global opposition and internal starvation. When the exhausted empire finally surrendered in 1918, the victorious Allies imposed the humiliating and devastating Treaty of Versailles. The German people were stripped of their sovereign territory, forced to pay unpayable financial reparations, and stripped of their military dignity. The Weimar Republic was instantly paralyzed by extreme poverty, terrifying hyperinflation, and violent political extremism, tearing the streets apart. The collective psychological trauma of total defeat created a desperate, humiliated population searching, frantically, for a savior who could restore their shattered national pride and economic stability. From this dark abyss of despair emerged Adolf Hitler, a master manipulator who weaponized the deepest fears and resentments of the German soul. He did not seize power through immediate violence, but by brilliantly exploiting the democratic system and promising a glorious return to imperial greatness. The helpless masses willingly surrendered their precious individual freedoms in exchange for the comforting illusion of absolute order and total national superiority. The consequence of this tragic surrender was the Second World War, an apocalyptic conflict that plunged human civilization into unprecedented moral darkness. The German state orchestrated the systematic annihilation of millions, transforming the pinnacle of European industrial efficiency into a terrifying machine of absolute mass murder. When the nightmare finally concluded in 1945, the nation lay in total physical ruin and incomprehensible spiritual disgrace. The heaviest burden a nation can carry is the unforgiving weight of its own history. The deepest wounds of a nation are rarely healed by time alone. They are stitched together by the relentless necessity of survival. Chapter 11. Division and Reconstruction. Following the apocalyptic devastation of 1945, the once magnificent German nation was violently cleaved in half by the victorious Allied powers. The majestic capital of Berlin was reduced to a haunting landscape of smoldering rubble, serving as the epicenter of the emerging Cold War. The surviving German citizens did not have the luxury of indulging in self-pity or philosophical despair. They faced the brutal, immediate reality of absolute starvation and severe winter cold. An unforgiving iron curtain swiftly descended across the bleeding continent, severing families, erasing ancient borders, and forging two entirely distinct ideological realities. In the East, the Soviet Union imposed a suffocating communist regime, extracting brutal reparations and stripping away entire functioning factories as retribution. In the West, the United States originally intended to permanently deindustrialize the German state, fearing the inevitable return of their terrifying military machine. However, the rapidly escalating threat of Soviet expansion forced a monumental shift in Western geopolitical strategy. The United States suddenly realized that a starving, desperate West Germany would inevitably succumb to the magnetic pull of global communism. Consequently, they initiated the magnificent Marshall Plan, pumping massive amounts of crucial financial aid into the ruined German economy to erect an unbreakable capitalist fortress directly upon the Soviet frontier. What happened next completely defied all conventional economic logic and astonished the entire watching world. Stripped of the suffocating burden of funding, a massive military arsenal, the highly disciplined German population channeled their immense collective energy entirely into industrial production. The legendary German engineering prowess miraculously awakened from the ashes, rapidly transforming destroyed factories into the most efficient and powerful manufacturing hubs on the European continent. While West Germany experienced an unprecedented economic miracle, the deep trauma of national division constantly haunted the collective soul. In 1961, the desperate communist regime in the East constructed the infamous Berlin Wall, a brutal concrete monument to human oppression and geopolitical failure. This terrifying barrier literally divided streets and murdered those who desperately attempted to flee toward the glowing prosperity of the West. A wall built to imprison the human spirit invariably becomes a monument to its utter fragility. A divided heart cannot sustain a living nation forever. Chapter 12. The Return of Unity. For nearly 3 decades, the brutal concrete imprisonment of the Berlin Wall stood as the ultimate symbol of a fractured human spirit. Yet, no artificial barrier constructed by tyranny can eternally suppress the primal human yearning for freedom and reunification. In the extraordinary autumn of 1989, the mighty Soviet Empire began to crumble from within, and the suffocating chains binding the East finally began to shatter. When the wall violently collapsed in November, the world witnessed a profound emotional eruption rarely seen in human history. Strangers wept and embraced amidst the smoldering rubble of their former prison. However, the official reunification in 1990 required a staggering economic sacrifice. The immensely wealthy West was forced to absorb a completely bankrupt and traumatized Eastern population, paying billions to stitch the severed national veins back together. Today, Germany has miraculously transformed from a shattered, morally bankrupt pariah state into the undisputed economic engine of the entire European continent. They no longer seek to dominate their neighbors through the terrifying application of iron and blood. Instead, they masterfully project their tremendous geopolitical influence through the peaceful and intricate networks of the European Union, guiding the continent with industrial precision and unwavering fiscal discipline. Yet, the modern German soul remains forever haunted by the unforgiving ghosts of its own catastrophic past. They must constantly perform an agonizing psychological balancing act. How can a nation wield massive economic and political power without triggering the terrifying historical paranoia of its neighbors? They carry a profound collective guilt, desperately seeking redemption while serving as the reluctant but necessary anchor for European stability. We view the monumental sweep of German history not merely as a chronicle of kings and wars, but as a terrifying mirror reflecting the absolute extremes of human nature. From the wild forests of the barbarians to the gilded halls of emperors, from the utter darkness of totalitarian annihilation to the shining glass of modern democracy, civilization is a fragile illusion that must be constantly protected from ourselves. The scars of history never truly fade. They simply become the architecture of the future. Thank you for joining me on this exhaustive journey through the depths of German history. If this documentary changed your perspective on the rise and fall of empires, please like this video and subscribe to my channel for more long-form historical explorations. If the greatest civilizations can be driven to utter madness by the seductive pursuit of absolute power, is humanity destined to endlessly repeat the brutal cycle of construction and destruction?